Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for DU Grand Challenges Forum Beyond Elections, Deliberation and Action for the Public Good. My name is Anne DePrince. I direct the Center for Community Engagement to Advance Scholarship and Learning, or CECL, and I am also co-lead of the Collaboration for the Public Good Working Group. That working group is the strategic leadership team for implementing DU Grand Challenges. And later on in the programming, we'll show you a list of folks on that group so that you know who to reach out to with questions or comments about DU Grand Challenges. Your first question might be, what is DU Grand Challenges? It is a family of programs here at the university that is designed to bring together community and university change makers to design, develop, aspire collaborative action to address complex public problems. This event is part of a series of forums to identify aspirations for advancing deliberation and action for the public good in our communities. Today, we're also kicking off a community table, the election edition. This is a month of conversations devoted to continuing to build community as we navigate our post-election world. We'll be reaching out to you after the forum today with more information on a community table and other steps that you can take through DU Grand Challenges to advance deliberation and action for the public good. So I want to tell you quickly what to expect today. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Provost Mary Clark, who will open the formal part of our program. Then we'll hear 4 lightning talks. These talks are designed to be brief and illuminating, basically to get us all thinking so that we're ready to engage with one another and think and talk and dialogue across our diverse perspectives. We hope we'll have a time for a few questions. So as ideas, questions, comments come up today, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A function. And then it'll be your turn. We'll transition from this webinar format to a Zoom meeting room to allow breakout conversations. Each breakout room will have a facilitator to help us connect and dialogue to explore shared aspirations for collaborative action. When we're ready to transition to the Zoom meeting room for the breakout conversations, we'll put that link into the chat so that you can just come on over, just as we would do if we were together in person. We'd start moving around the room. So we'll get you into a new room for conversation. Before we launch the part of the program focused on speakers today, we also want to make a few important acknowledgements. First, we want to acknowledge that though we're not together in person today, we are certainly connected by the university and the land that it sits upon. The Cheyenne and Arapaho are the original stewards of that land, and we wish to acknowledge their sacrifices and hardships, as well as other indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home. We'd also like to acknowledge the work of staff across the university who made this forum today possible. Particularly the IT staff and our colleagues who make it possible to connect virtually at this time, as well as facilities and custodial staff who work to make sure that the campus is a safe place when we are able to visit there. We are also very glad to be able to acknowledge our outstanding collaborators for this forum, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DU Dialogues, Community and Values Initiative. Thank you so much for working with us to make this programming possible. Now it is my great honor to welcome and introduce Provost Mary Clark, who will provide some opening remarks. Thank you, Provost Clark, for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I'll say I just met with the tribal elders of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes this afternoon as part of the Native American Community Advisory Board. It was a very moving conversation. So I'm glad that you referenced them and recognized them. I am so delighted to be here this afternoon to be with you. I've heard such wonderful things about DU Grand Challenges, but I've not experienced the programming directly, have not sat at a community table. So I'm glad to partake this afternoon. And indeed, it's emblematic of what most attracted me to DU, and that is the commitment to the public good. It's a commitment that I myself hold strongly and saw so well evidenced in my interviews and initial contacts with DU. So, so glad to be here. So glad to learn more about the DU Grand Challenges. It's just a model program, and we're so fortunate to have you at the helm of the program. Well, I want to make sure we have as much time as possible for our conversations today. So let me introduce our lightning speakers. We will start with Dr. Apryl Alexander, who's Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology and is co-chair of FOCA this year, the Faculty of Color Association. So very nice to see you, Apryl. Thank you for joining us. Apryl will be followed by Dr. Mei Lin, a postdoctoral fellow in IRISE, who's working with the Social Movements Support Lab. So thank you, Mei, for joining us. Following Mei will be June Churchill, who is an undergraduate student government senator, quite active and committed to her work with the student government. And then finally, we have Colorado State Representative Leslie Herrod, who will close out the lightning talks. We're honored to have all of our speakers here today, and especially so to Representative Herrod. Thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. So Dr. Alexander, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Provost Clark. Hi, I'm Dr. Apryl Alexander, Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology. This is me just a few months ago in Greenwood Village. We had just passed Senate Bill 217, the most comprehensive police accountability and integrity bill in the country. But in Greenwood Village, the City Council had decided that they weren't going to abide by that bill, that they actually said that they would support officers who act in bad faith. Our fellow panelist, Representative Leslie Herrod, had invited me to speak in Greenwood Village that night. And one of the things that I said that night is, we're not done yet. We still have a lot of work to do. And while I meant that in that moment, I mean it today as well. That at Greenwood Village that day, I saw that the crowds were dwindling. The people that were showing up to protest and rallies earlier in the summer were starting to slow down. People were starting to get tired. Next slide. This has been a very difficult year, and that's an understatement, that we've had so much go on within our nation. From COVID-19 exacerbating a lot of the systemic inequities that we've known for so long, to the Black Lives Matter movement doing the same thing, bringing attention to state-sanctioned violence that has been around for centuries. Then on top of that, thinking about how we navigate our schools and thinking about the climate surrounding the presidential election, we were faced with so many different things. One of my biggest fears right now is that we'll forget about all of this. That maybe a year from now, we have a vaccine, we maybe have different people in office, and we forget everything that happened in 2020. But we can't forget this time because, again, we have so much more to do. Next slide. We can't ignore what COVID-19 did to our nation. We found out that so many of our systems failed us. That when we had to shut down, people couldn't get unemployment. We figured out that the digital divide is real, that when people don't have access to broadband internet, they can't show up to their court appearances, they can't engage in schoolwork, and they can't continue with their normal day-to-day activities. We also learned that health disparities extend to pandemics, that COVID-19 wreaked havoc on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We know that all of these things that we've been talking about for so long had been highlighted in this very moment. And this wasn't just the only thing that happened this year. Again, next slide. When we talk about the situation involving police violence or state-sanctioned violence by police, this has been going on for a long time. So why were people showing up this year? That the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. And so many people have died since. While this year we were brought to the attention of the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Elijah McClain, there are so many who are nameless in this movement. And so between COVID-19 and police sanctioned violence, we had to think of how do we change our systems? Next slide. And so our communities had to come together to have difficult conversations. A lot of things that activists have been talking about for decades are now pop culture terms, that now people are talking about abolition or defunding the police. Now everybody's talking about the term implicit bias, and can we have trainings for that? So in this moment, we're thinking about how do we be creative in a time of crisis? And again, I worry that people are becoming complacent. Next slide. Because even though we've been marching for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and so many others for the last few months, people have been slowing down. But this issue of state-sanctioned violence hasn't slowed down a bit. Some folks who may have followed me on Twitter saw that I reposted this from a local journalist. He said all of these incidents happened in 24 hours in our community. And so when I'm thinking about our future, I'm thinking about, are we going to remember 2020? And what are we going to do to correct the actions that happened this year? Next slide. So for me, when I'm thinking about grand challenges, and currently I'm the co-lead of the crime and safety cohort as a part of the DU Grand Challenges, I'm thinking about what does it mean to have community safety? Where do we have an environment where everyone feels safe? That could be safety from a virus, safety from being unhoused, or safety from police violence. What would it look like to have transformative justice, a process that brings accountability and resolution through communities? So going forward, we need to think about how do we define community safety? Who's in charge of that community safety? Even if we do get convictions for these police officers who killed Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Elijah McClain, what is justice? How do our communities heal from that systemic intergenerational trauma that's happened to them? And how do we have an area in which we can repair harm? Next slide. So what I hope for us to do in this moment and for us to dialogue about tonight is how do we receive justice? We can't forget the events of 2020, that with a lot of civil rights movements and social justice movements, we forget about them just a few years later. The 24-hour news cycle makes us go on to the next issue that's before us. I challenge us not to forget 2020 and many of the lessons that we may have learned this year and all the inequities that continue to exist in our system. And let's work together as a community to have transformative justice. Thank you so much today.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. That was fantastic. So again, my name is May, and I'm a postdoc at iRise, working specifically on the Social Movement Support Lab. So my talk very much picks up these themes from Dr. Alexander to not forget and to really continue this work. You know, on an uplifting note, I think last week and what we see in its wake is really a testament to the power of social movements led by communities of color. From Black women-led coalitions in Georgia to Latinx and Native organizing in Arizona, these movements offer a wealth of lessons, not only for electoral wins, but for these long-term visions of justice that Dr. Alexander just talked about. Next slide, please. Now, what these movements have accomplished is no small feat. Social change requires both depth, that is deep organizing like leadership development and political education, and breadth, the power of numbers and voters and other kinds of mobilizations. While organizing groups have often been excluded from the resources needed to scale up their wins to big numbers, entities like political parties who do have the resources to do mass voter mobilization often don't stick around for that deep work outside of elections. So how do we do both? You know, the groups behind the victories that we saw last week and the last several years, and of course before, use many power building strategies. Today, I'm just going to talk about one called integrated voter engagement, or IVE. This is a strategy that social movements use to merge deep organizing and mass voter engagement towards long-lasting transformation of the electorate and society more broadly. And of course, this doesn't just come from nowhere. This approach really continues long legacies of Black organizing that have built power through voting as one of many arenas in the fight for liberation. So I'll just give a few examples here. I've linked also a report that I worked on about IVE for further rating, and happy to also follow up for folks who are interested. Next slide, please. So as many of you perhaps know all too well, traditional get out the vote often takes the form of a deluge of calls, ads, knocks on your door right before the election. That is, if your community is reached out to by political parties, which many BIPOC communities are not. And these resources and attention often disappear the day after the election. In contrast, organizing groups put in the time, day after day, year after year, regardless of whether it's election season or not. Organizing is really rooted in a consistent process of building relationships, trust, and community. As Dr. Alexander pointed out in our conversations around defunding the police, public opinion is not static. A flood of text the week before the election is probably not going to change your ideas on really key policies and ideas. But multiple conversations over time, ideally with someone you trust and know, can challenge deeply ingrained biases and really move those hearts and minds. For example, with IVE, groups are reaching beyond their immediate membership, and they're really calling large numbers of voters using technology that helps them reach large numbers like predictive dialers. And what's key is they don't do this just during, but between election seasons to really understand where voters are coming from, let them know about the organizations and their ways to get plugged in, and to really follow up repeatedly. And this is a time investment that pays off in a lot of different ways. Next slide, please. The next theme I want to highlight is really trusting community expertise. A lot of times traditional, political party-led get out the vote often involves resourcing outside consultants, sort of flooding into communities. But grassroots organizing centers the leadership of those most impacted by injustice. They recognize that the messenger matters. Grassroots leaders who are already being cultivated by organizing groups have real expertise from lived experience and deep knowledge of the communities that they're reaching out to. So it's grassroots leaders and not outsiders who are further honing their skills by leading voter outreach programs. So for example, in California, where I'm working remotely, we've won several criminal justice reform ballot initiatives. And through these programs, formerly incarcerated folks are the ones leading them, and they're really able to sway voters on the phone lines and at the doors by speaking about their personal experiences. Next slide, please. The final theme I want to point out is transformation and not transactions. Grassroots organizing is driven not just to extract votes and to win any one election. Elections are markers towards a longer path to social transformation. My co-authors and I wrote that IVE is about transforming who votes, the issues they vote on, and redefining notions of citizenship and civic participation among those who are or have been excluded from voting. This approach can foster what an organizer described as a cycle of wins. Movements are winning policies, making a real difference in their members' lives, and they're really electing folks from their communities. Seeing the impact of your engagement can spark enthusiasm to continue being an actor in everyday civic life and politics. And this in turn can grow the ranks of our folks pushing for change. Next slide. To conclude, I want to shout out, I know there's many folks at DU who are already engaged in this kind of movement building work, not just IVE, but beyond. And I know, there may be some folks who have a newfound interest. All of us are needed, and I'm happy to, or I'm thrilled to connect with all of you at the Social Movement Support Lab. Confronting power demands that movements do it all. You have to go big, but you also have to be deeply grounded. And that means that all of us have critical roles to play as we listen to and follow the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Thank you.
I don't have slides. I'm just going to be talking. Thank you, Provost Clark, for the introduction, and Katie for inviting me. I'm so excited. I'm also very nervous to be speaking here today alongside such giants of activism in the Denver area and many people I look up to as role models. It was really hard figuring out what to talk about today, but since we attend a primarily white and upper class institution, I elected to talk about how to use privilege for social change. I was born into a rich family. My parents are multimillionaires. I grew up surrounded by mansions and golf courses next to the Five Diamond Broadmoor Hotel and Resort in Colorado Springs. I went to a top-ranked private college preparatory school for 12 years. The only time I stepped into a public school was to take private clarinet lessons. I was also born a heterosexual and able-bodied white man. For the first 18 years of my life, I did not face any societal hardships. However, that all changed once I figured out that I was trans. After a few months, I finally ran away from home because of my parents' extreme emotional and mental abuse. Suddenly, there I was, crying on a sidewalk early in the morning, faced with my reality. I was homeless and poor and queer in a conservative city without even shoes on my feet. Within a matter of hours, my entire future disappeared, and so much of the freedom that I enjoyed from my upbringing faded away, being replaced with hardship and uncertainty. I knew from that day forward that no one should ever experience pain like that. Systems of oppression lie all around us, both obvious and hidden. They are complex and interlinked webs of policy, societal norms, individual actions, and group prerogatives. There is no easy way to fight these systems, because for most oppressive systems, if you are not actively working against them, you are reinforcing them. Silence is complicity. So what can you do if you benefit from one of these systems, like race, class, ability status, etc.? The first step is to educate yourself. Holding privilege lets you ignore the obstacles faced by oppressed people. Read a book, go to a talk, listen to a community leader, and do not assume the universality of your experience. Most importantly, listen to and trust marginalized groups and people when they name their oppressions. Once you get educated, observe the environment around you. For example, if you just educated yourself about ability status, when you look around, you notice how there are no wheelchair ramps in your building, no braille on the signs, and no interpreters in your meetings. Always ask yourself, who built this environment and for whom? Finally, take action. Once you increase your knowledge and perception of oppression, you can then lean on the other side of privilege, power. To showcase this process, here's an example from my own life. First, I started by attaining a leadership position in the Queer Student Alliance. I figured that since I was an independent student without parents or family to answer to, I could openly advocate for queer students without fear of retribution. And I was politically competent from my time in Model UN in high school. So I began working on moving DU to being more LGBTQ+ friendly and inclusive. However, I began to see how DU continually ignored student activists pushing for change. So I ran to be a senator in the undergraduate student government and was elected. That first year, I quickly began using my platform to pass resolutions calling for tuition decreases, divesting DU from fossil fuels, and amplifying the voices of students on campus. I continued to build power in coalitions with multiple student organizations and movements, including Divest EU, We Can Do Better, and most recently, the RAR Collective. USG now acts as a bullhorn for student demands, lending strength to marginalized voices. I use my power and skills to assist those movements and buoy activists. And so I pose to you all in the audience, what are your skills and how will you use them for justice? The lesson I want you to take away is privilege is a powerful tool when used correctly, but a word of caution. To quote Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. By choosing to use your privilege in this manner, you must commit to abolishing privilege altogether, and with it the power that accompanies it. I believe that is more than a worthy sacrifice for a just world, and I ask that you all join me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much. You'd think I'd get used to this by now. Hello, everyone. I'm State Representative Leslie Herrod. I just want to thank my fellow panelists for sharing their insights and for particularly their activism and work in the community to ensure that all of our voices are heard. I do represent House District 8, which is in Central and Northeast Denver. And I'm here to just talk about, what happens after we vote. So as you guys all know, we had quite a historic moment this past week in electing Vice President Kamala Harris to the highest office in the land, second highest office in the land as Vice President, and making true history. A lot of people ask, are we done now? And of course, the answer is absolutely not. And I know this firsthand. In 2016, I was elected as the first African-American LGBTQ person to hold office in Colorado. And if I thought my work stopped then, I would have definitely been wrong. Now the real hard work actually does begin, because once we get someone elected into office, we're not done. We must continue to hold them accountable. Because if I would have just sat and not heard from my community at all afterwards, we definitely wouldn't have the Police Accountability and Integrity Act that Dr. Alexander spoke about. Because I acted because my community demanded that I do. So we must continue to be active in the political process if we want to make true change. You know, right now, all of the polls and pundits are talking about who showed up, who turned out, and that means who matters, who we should listen to when we're creating policy that actually will impact people's lives. And the narrative is not going to be great. It's always going to be spun, I think, against those who are traditionally marginalized or those who don't tend to have representation in a Capitol building or seen in policy. And we have to change that. So just because you elect someone who looks like you or who looks different than the person currently in office, it doesn't mean that your work is done. We must continue to activate. What does that mean, right? So 217 is a great example of what activism actually looks like. This past election, I would say, was activism at the ballot box. Activists showed up and voted in large numbers, right? But then we have to take that kind of activism and also use that as legislative activism. For Senate Bill 217, I think it was the first time I've seen community truly engage on policy reform at a broad level. One of my colleagues said she got about 38,000 emails pushing for 217 or calling for justice for Elijah McClain. That was unheard of. We've got to continue to be active. The reason why we were able to pass 217 in the way that it was, sweeping legislative reform, was because people said, vote for this bill and don't water it down. And folks heard from their constituents across the board. That is so important. So continue to lift your voices up from issues that matter to you, right? Talk about police reform if that's for you. Talk about defunding the police. Talk about climate justice, reproductive justice, immigration reform. All of those things we need to continue to talk about. And people need to understand that if we don't make real change on these issues, that you will not invite us back for another year or 2 years or 3 years at our jobs, right? That we will be out of office. But make it clear that your one voice needs to be amplified. So that means continue to activate, but also bring free friends, bring people, make sure that you're building coalitions with folks and sometimes unlikely folks who can continue to lift your voice, who can continue to talk about those issues as well, because the strength is in numbers. People have to feel like it's not just one person holding them accountable that they can ignore, but that it's a community holding them accountable that they cannot ignore. And if they want to come back, they have to show up and they have to vote right and run the bills that we want to see run. So my goal while I'm in office is not necessarily to be your voice. It's to bring you to the table. And so right now is the time when legislators are sitting in our homes and we are writing policy. We're thinking about what we're going to introduce in January at the state level. Now is the time to reach out. Now is the time to talk to us about what kind of change you want to see. Give us ideas, and hopefully we will run those bills. And if it's not your legislator, it could be a legislator who is doing the work that you already want to see done, which means someone who is on a committee, right? Maybe you care about criminal justice reform, look at the Judiciary Committee. Maybe you care about education, look there and find someone who you think will listen to you, listen to your perspective and tell them what your thoughts are and how you can make people's lives better. I will say that every single one of my bills has come from the community, from someone speaking out from the community saying this is something that needs to change. And that's how I've gotten my ideas. So do that, be that person in the community to push those ideas. So show up. Activism is definitely at the ballot box, but it continues in legislation, it continues in our communities, and it also continues in the personal conversations that we're having today. So thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of this amazing group. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Herrod, as well as all of the panelists for some outstanding talks. We'd love to take time for a couple of questions or comments, maybe things you're curious about, links you see between the talks. Go ahead and enter those now into the Q&A. And thank you very much to at least one attendee who wanted to give a shout out to the speakers for such excellent and important messages. We'd love to hear your questions, though, if folks have them, including the panelists, if you would like to ask each other anything to follow up as well. Give that a second. All right. Well, we have a quiet group. It seems like perhaps they are saving their discussion energy for the breakout rooms in a moment. So I'm going to, we have a question here. Thank you, kind anonymous attendee. We have a question here. When folks are feeling so exhausted, how do we find the motivation and drive to keep fighting for ourselves and our communities? Anyone on the panel willing to address that? Again, when folks are feeling so exhausted, how do we find the motivation and drive to keep fighting for ourselves and our communities?
Yeah, I think, so this is a great question. And one thing I forgot to add was run for office. And as June popped back up on the screen, I thought, well, this is going to be exciting because I can't wait to see June in this different elected offices in the public arena very soon. I can see I have an eye for that. So I would say that this work is extremely exhausting. It's extremely exhausting because we care about it, right? And it impacts us and our friends and our families and our communities. I don't actually believe in work-life balance because it doesn't exist for me. Right? There's really no such thing when our bodies are on the line every single day and people are debating legislation that's very personal, right? It's very personal whether or not I'm able to marry the person that I want, that I love, right? That's very personal. But we have to. And so what I would say is when you're exhausted and you need to keep fighting, you want to find that drive in yourself, knowing that you're making real change, but also take a break, If you need to take the weekend, take the weekend. I tell my good friend and son in the movement, Tay Anderson, you don't have to be at every rally. You don't have to be at everything you're invited to be at. And then I have to remind myself the same thing, right? That we have to take time for ourselves and we have to take care of our own mental health as well. So I started seeing a therapist again recently. It's important. I didn't think that I had time to in the past. We got to stop doing that. We got to stop doing that to ourselves and make sure that we are as whole as possible. So we bring our whole selves to this work. And it is very tiring, but keep fighting because we're making a difference. The last thing I'll say is 2020 has been a sucky year. It's been exhausting. It's been tiring. It's hitting us from all sides. But I do believe when we get to the other side of it, we'll see the immense growth that has happened. We have a vice president-elect who is a Black woman. We have passed sweeping police accountability and integrity legislation here in Colorado. We have uncovered the ugliness of racial inequality and white supremacy, and people are having to face it head on. These are huge things that have been very traumatizing, been very painful, but we have to go through it. And I think with that pain, we will have huge gain and huge changes in this country. So thank you so much for your question. I understand why you're tired. Take a nap and get back to work.
All right, there's a question on taking the me and community work to make individual changes in our lives at tackling institutional and social societal issues. This is one that I would like to take on because it's something that I've worked a lot on. For me, my personal growth and individual growth has been very closely tied to my activism and my work there. Because I think what is very powerful about activism work and about participating in social movements is that it really helps you build empathy and compassion for others. It lets you see how others are living their lives and how they're handling the issues that they're confronted with, which I then believe that you can use to bring into your own life and think about how you can actually improve yourself at the same time. On a similar note, personal growth can feed directly into community activism. I grew up conservative. I grew up in a libertarian household. If you know Glenn Beck, I have met him in person, and I thought he was a great guy at the time. But through my individual growth since then, I then realized the power of community activism. And one last note I can say is that not every activist space that you have to be in is one of, like speaking truth to power and going out to a march or going and pestering the DU administration, right? There are some spaces where you can just sit down and spend some, nice time with folks who do activism. Just talk about the things that make you happy, or just spend the time to sit down and participate in a healing space rather than a fighting space. Not saying those two are completely separate, but there's definitely space for that where you can grow individually and support a community movement at the same time.
Thank you, June. Representative Herrod, while we have the benefit of your time here today, we have a couple of questions about how to be most effective in getting your ideas in front of elected officials, how to get ideas in front of you in particular, but more generally, what are the most effective, persuasive ways to engage with your elected officials?
Yeah. I think showing up is important. So, showing up, I see city council meetings can feel tedious. They are. They're a little less tedious when you're on Zoom because at least you can watch TV in the background or do something else. But they are tedious. And I think it's important, though, to show up for those things, to kind of become familiar with the process so that we can become familiar with you. But also Twitter is still one of the most effective ways to reach out to your legislator. People don't realize that, but at a state and local level, we don't have a lot of staff. And we are the ones who are actually reading our tweets because it's coming to our phones. And so you can also reach out that way. For me, you can send me an email and I will find time to meet with you. It might take a little bit to schedule, but we will meet. And if you send information about what you're speaking of, what you want to speak about, you can speak to me or my staff. So follow your elected official on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter is usually where we are. Some are cool enough for TikTok. I have not figured it out. And then reach out via email. We also get our emails. Most of my emails are answered by my staff, but I do see them, I get them. And that's the best ways to reach out to us, I believe. And then as you get, to higher offices, there are more people. You're less likely to meet directly with that elected official. And if you are, you might feel like that time you're meeting with them is a bit inconsequential. Don't take the staff for granted. The staff is the one who has that elected official's ear. I was staff for Governor Ritter, and I was the one who advised him. So me spending that hour with someone who actually cared that they were meeting with me, took it seriously, and spent time to help me understand what policy they were trying to push, they had a better chance of getting that to the governor's ear, right? Because I couldn't decide whether or not I was going to put it in his memo or not. And that's really important. And so do take the time to have those meetings, reach out to us. If we're a local elected official, we should meet with you. Your local elected official should definitely meet with you. If they don't, maybe you should let folks know that they refused. It worked for Cory Gardner.
Thank you. We have another question for all of the panelists, especially thinking about folks who are new to the Denver community. How do you recommend that they get engaged in organizing activist related work? What are the ways in that you have found to this work that you would recommend to, especially those who are new to our community?
I think, June mentioned this. I think it's really important to actually get involved in a community-based organization that's fighting for the change that you want to see. It's fine to be a lone wolf and kind of go at it on your own. That actually can be effective too. But it's also great to join groups like Calor, right? Or to join groups that are organizing like CIRC, Colorado Immigration Rights Coalition, around issues that you care about. So get involved. And now I just think it's so much easier because while we are on Zoom overload, there are so many Zoom meetings that you can just join, or you can listen in on a Facebook discussion and see if that's the right group for you. So get involved in that way and then show up. We like folks who will show up in whatever way, virtually or in person, and do the work, and sometimes that work could mean knocking doors, passing out things, organizing call lists, things like that, but it all matters. So just show up and do the work. And sometimes it's important to lead and step into those leadership positions. And sometimes it's important just to support people who are leading. So do that too. But I actually think one of the most effective ways to get involved in community activism is to be a part of an organization that you support. And then also follow your activist friends on Twitter, on social media too. They'll tell you where the next event is, where they're organizing. I mean, I think showing up at those protests, people say protests don't matter. That is a hot lie. And they want you to believe that so that you can stop protesting and changing the world. But protests do in fact matter. And we've seen that not only at the ballot box, but in the change in policies that we've made recently. So also keep protesting.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to address that before we're going to transition soon to the to breakout rooms and discussion?
Yeah, I was going to comment, but Leslie covered it. Just show up. People notice when you're popping up in a community over and over again. I have friends on this call who I've met over the summer just because we're in the same spaces. So finding out what those kind of local events are, usually through social media, is just so helpful. Just finding out about those groups that you support. I found out about BLM 5280 by going to an event by the Denver Justice Project. And I was like, oh, this is a cool group, let me join. And so once you get out there and involved, you start finding community, whether it's your community, however you define that, or the broader community, and you'll get that recognition. You start connecting with people. I met Representative Herrod because I attended one of her workshops to get people of color running for office, and we built that connection ever since. So it's just about showing up and listening, especially for allies, showing up and just listening and figuring out where you can fit in.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your amazing talks, as well as for these thoughtful discussion points. There are more questions in the chat, so I'm really excited that folks have ideas that you want to connect with other people about, because that's the next part of the event. So I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Katie Klein-Hesseling, the DU Grand Challenges Program Manager, to walk us through what's going to happen next.
Hello, thank you, Anne, for that, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your thoughts. Such powerful inspiration for this next conversation and for our work moving forward. And we did have one last comment in the questions to just let you all know that you are all fabulous human beings. So we'll be moving now to small group conversations. I just wanted to share a couple of guidelines before we do. So we'll be in smaller groups, maybe 7-ish folks per group. So when you arrive, you'll have a facilitator in your group. Well, if you could just be mindful for the following guidelines: one speaker at a time, share to increase understanding and invite others in. Listen to understand and listen harder when you disagree. Speak from your own personal experience using I statements and avoid generalizations, and always just be attentive to the space that you're taking so that others may also share. So you can now go to the Zoom room to be moved to a breakout room. The link is here on the slide. And Anne has also dropped it in the chat. So you need only click on that link and you'll be moved to the next part of our program. Thank you all so much for being here, and I look forward to our conversations. Thank you.